Alaska isn't just a place. It's a living, breathing thing that learns your name. Alaska spans 663,000 square miles, but holds only 730,000 people. The rest of the space belongs to something else. Good evening, friends. Tonight, I prepared horror stories that could happen to me or anyone living in this frozen wasteland, where fear dwells in every inch of the state. Please subscribe to the channel to help me reach 1,000 subscribers, leave a like, and share it with your friends. Welcome to the terror. Welcome to Alaska. My father used to say that Alaska doesn't test you the way other places test you. Other places test your patience, your fitness, your willingness to endure discomfort. Alaska tests your willingness to be forgotten. That's a different category of examination entirely, and you don't understand what he meant until you've lived it, until you've spent enough consecutive nights in a place so far removed from the circulatory system of American life that you start to feel not just isolated but genuinely subtracted, removed from the count, erased from the running tally of people the country is keeping track of. I moved to a property outside of Talkeetna 6 years ago with my wife, Karen, because we wanted land, real land, the kind you can't afford anywhere that has a Costco within 40 minutes. We got it. 12 acres of spruce and birch and one frozen creek and a view of the Alaska Range that, on clear days, included Denali itself, that impossible white mass on the horizon that looks less like a mountain and more like a load-bearing wall holding up the sky. Karen lasted 3 years. I don't blame her. I watched it happen and I understood every stage of it, the way the silence started as something she described as peaceful and gradually became something she described as oppressive and finally became something she stopped describing because describing it meant acknowledging that the thing she agreed to was not the thing she'd gotten. She went back to Tacoma. She calls on birthdays. We are cordial in the exhausted way of two people who made a large mistake together and have each separately absorbed their share of the cost. I stayed because leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, and because the debt on the property was structured in a way that made selling it a net loss, and because, and this is the true reason, the one underneath all the financial reasoning, I had started to believe that if I left the land would win. That it would have beaten me. That the wilderness would have looked at me the way it looks at everything and found me insufficient, and I would have to carry that finding for the rest of my life. So I hunted. That became the organizing principle of my calendar, the thing that gave shape to the seasons. I am a competent hunter, not exceptional, not the kind of man who has a system or a philosophy about it, just someone who learned from his father and his father's father and who finds in the practice a quality of attention that the rest of life rarely demands. You stop thinking about your mortgage. You stop thinking about whether you made the right choices. You are present in the way that genuine risk makes you present, because the land is alive and consequential and it will absolutely kill you if you let your mind wander to the wrong thing at the wrong moment. I hunted black bear in the fall, moose in September, and whitetail and caribou where the terrain and licensing allowed. I knew the forest west of my property the way I knew my own house. Every drainage, every game trail, every cluster of spruce that the moose favored in early winter when the snow depth elsewhere pushed them to sheltered ground. That October I had been in the woods since 6 in the morning. Cold, clear, the kind of Alaskan fall morning that looks like a photograph of itself, the light coming in low and gold through the birch trees, the snow just deep enough to track in but not so deep it slowed movement. I was working a ridge about 2 miles from the house, following fresh moose sign, deep, splayed prints in the crust, the kind a large bull makes, when I came down off the ridge into a drainage and found the first one. An elk. Full-grown cow, maybe 600 pounds. Hanging from a spruce tree at a height I will not stop trying to explain away because the alternative is something I am not equipped to process. The lowest branch was 12 feet off the ground. She was suspended above it, hung across the branch the way you'd hang a jacket over a chair back, both sides of her body dangling. No rope. No wire. Nothing visible connecting her to the tree. Just the clean, solid fact of her being there, too high for any predator and now, in a position that requires either an explanatory framework I don't have or a very long silence where the explanation should be. She'd been opened. Not mauled. I know what mauling looks like. I've seen bear and wolf work before. I know the chaotic opportunism of predator feeding. This was different. The incision along the ventral surface was clean in a way that made my jaw tighten, a straight line from sternum to pelvis that had been executed with a precision that belonged in an abattoir, not a forest. The viscera had been removed. All of it. And the cavity was empty and wiped, which is not something nature does, which is not a thing the wind does or the cold does or any force that I have a name for. I stood underneath her for longer than was probably sensible, just looking, my rifle hanging useless in my hand because there was nothing to point it at. The cold was 22 degrees. My breath came out in short visible bursts. The forest around me was quiet in a way I immediately registered as wrong. No ravens, no chickadees, no gray jays, none of the ambient small noise that normally fills even a quiet stretch of spruce forest. Birds go silent for two reasons: severe weather and the presence of something that frightens them. The sky was clear. The barometric pressure hadn't moved in 12 hours. I marked the GPS coordinates. I took photographs on my phone. I told myself there was an explanation and walked northeast, because I had driven 4 hours from the house to hunt this area, and the rational, steady part of me that pays the property taxes and the truck insurance said to keep moving and think about the elk later. I found this second one 40 minutes later, less than a quarter mile away. Another elk. Same size. Same height. Same incision. Same appalling, meticulous emptiness inside. Hung on a spruce at the exact same impossible height as the first, oriented in the same direction, head pointing northeast, both dangling sides parallel to the ground with a geometric precision that made me stop walking and stand very still for a moment while my body caught up with what my eyes were telling it. I am not a person who panics. I want to establish that clearly because what I did next is going to sound like panic, and I need you to understand it wasn't. It was a reasoned and appropriate recalibration of risk. I turned around and began walking back the way I'd come, quickly, not running, keeping my pace controlled and my eyes moving across the tree line, because something that can lift 600 pounds into a spruce canopy is something I want to see before it sees me, if that sequence is even available to me, which, standing in that forest with the birds silent and the second elk hanging 12 feet overhead, I was not at all confident it was. I found 7 of them. 7 elk in a line that I would later, sitting at my kitchen table in the house outside Talkeetna with every light on and the wood stove burning hot enough to be irresponsible, plot on a topographic map using the GPS coordinates I'd taken at each location. 7 points. A straight line. Not approximately straight, not roughly straight, straight in the mathematical sense, within a margin of error so small it would have required survey equipment to detect. A straight line cutting through the forest on a bearing I measured at 47 degrees northeast, spaced at intervals that, when I entered them into a spreadsheet because I needed to do something with my hands, came out to exactly 1,847 feet between each point. Every time. 6 intervals, 6 measurements, all of them 1,847 feet, which is not a naturally occurring number and not the kind of precision that results from coincidence and not a thing that happened by accident. 7 elk suspended in a mathematically perfect line at a consistent height I estimated at 12 to 14 feet, all of them surgically opened and emptied, all of them positioned head northeast, in a forest that had been silent for the entire 4 hours I spent among them. I found the clearing at the end of the line. I want to be honest about my state of mind at this point, which was functional but degraded, the way a car runs with a flat tire. It moves, it covers ground, but something fundamental is compromised and the driver is aware of it, aware that he is operating outside of safe parameters, aware that a sensible person would have stopped. A sensible person would have turned around at the second elk. I kept going because the alternative was to drive 4 hours back to a house where I was the only person and sit with what I'd seen without the context of what was at the end, and the not knowing felt more dangerous than the knowing, which is a cognitive error I have made before and will probably make again. The fire in the clearing was recent. The ash was warm when I put my hand over it, not hot, warm the way coals go before they die completely, which put it at 6 to 12 hours old. The clearing itself was maybe 60 feet across, a natural gap in the spruce where the ground was flat and the snow was packed and disturbed in ways that told a story I could only partially read. Foot traffic, multiple sources, the kind of disturbance a camp makes when people have been there for a period of time. Deer marks in the snow. The circular compression of something cylindrical, a tent base, maybe, or a cook stove. And in the center of the ash, precisely centered, sitting on a piece of flat gray rock that someone had placed there deliberately, a single child's shoe. A sneaker. Red, with a white sole, maybe a child size 4. No mate. No other clothing, no personal effects, nothing that would tell me where it came from or how it had arrived at the center of a fire circle at the end of a line of 7 eviscerated elk in a forest with no road access within 6 miles. I'm not proud of what came next, which was that I picked it up. I don't know why. The same compulsion that kept me walking toward the clearing instead of away from it, the same broken sensor that is supposed to trigger avoidance and instead triggered approach. I picked it up and looked at it, and it was a normal child sneaker, the kind that comes from Target or Walmart, the kind that exists in tens of millions of households across the country in various states of wear. It was not new. The tread was worn on the outside edge the way children wear their shoes when they pronate outward. Someone's kid had worn this shoe for a while. Someone's kid had put it on in the morning in whatever house they lived in and taken it off at night and worn it to school or the park or wherever children go in the communities I was aware of in this part of Alaska, Talkeetna, Trapper Creek, the smaller settlements off the park's highway, and then at some point, through some sequence of events that I could not construct, it had arrived here. I called my neighbor. His name is Bill Okafor and he lives 4 miles from my property, close enough for Alaska, and he is the person I call when I need to verify that I am reading a situation correctly because he was born in this state and he has 40 years of experience with its strangeness and he does not alarm easily. I told him what I'd found. I described the elk. I described the line. I told him about the shoe. Bill was quiet for long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Don't move anything," he said. "I already picked up the shoe." "Put it back," he said, and the flatness of his voice, the immediate instruction without explanation or question, hit me in a place I didn't expect. "Put it back exactly where it was. Then leave. Don't touch anything else. Come home. Bill." "Owen," he said, and he said my name the way you say someone's name when you are trying to get them to stop doing a thing with their body rather than engage with a thing in their mind. "Come home right now." I put the shoe back. I tried to put it in the center of the flat rock, tried to match what I remembered of its position. Then I walked out of the forest the way I'd come in, along the line of elk, past each impossible suspended form, back up the ridge, back to my truck, for hours of driving back to the property outside Talkeetna. I called the Alaska State Troopers from my kitchen. The dispatcher took my information and told me a trooper would contact me. A trooper named Hendricks called the next morning and drove out that afternoon, and I showed him the GPS coordinates and the photographs on my phone, and he looked at them with the careful absence of expression that law enforcement people practice until it becomes reflex. He drove out to the site the following day with a wildlife officer and a second trooper. They came back in the late afternoon. Hendricks sat in my kitchen and drank the coffee I offered him and was quiet for a period of time that I found deeply unsettling. "The elk are there," he said. "What you described." "And the clearing?" "And the clearing." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "The shoe was still there." "Have there been any missing children?" That's an active inquiry, he said, which is the phrase that means I will not be telling you what I know. He looked at me with the even, unrevealing expression. Are you the only person with regular access to this property? I told him yes, since Karen left. And you didn't hear anything? During the night prior? I thought about the nights prior. I thought about what nights were like in that house, alone, with the forest pressing in from all sides and the nearest neighbor 4 miles away and the nearest town 20 minutes down a road that became unreliable in winter. I thought about how I'd stopped really listening to the night sounds a long time ago, the way you stop hearing traffic when you live near a highway, the way your brain categorizes familiar inputs as non-threatening and files them away without presenting them for review. I thought about what might have moved through the forest behind my house on a night I had designated as routine. No, I said. I didn't hear anything. Hendricks left his card. He told me to call if I thought of anything else, which is what investigators say when they have what they need from you and are not planning to share reciprocally. I stood in the doorway and watched his truck reverse out of my driveway and disappear down the road, and then I stood there for a moment longer in the cold, looking at the tree line behind the house, at the spruce forest that began 30 meters from my back door and ran west for miles without interruption, and I tried to calculate the distance between where I was standing and the clearing, and I tried to determine whether a straight line extended 47 degrees northeast from the center of that clearing would pass through my property. It would. I had the topographic map on the kitchen table. I drew the line with a ruler. It passed through the northeast corner of my 12 acres, maybe 200 meters from the house. The line of 7 elk had been aimed, in the geometric sense, at me, or at my property, or at the clearing, or at something along that bearing that I did not have the information to identify. I drew it and looked at it, and the wood stove was going and the house was warm and the kitchen light was on, and outside it was dark in the way Alaska is dark in October, not the soft darkness of populated places with their ambient glow and light pollution and the collective brightness of 1,000 households nearby, but the hard, total, uncommented darkness of a wilderness that does not generate its own light and does not apologize for it. I thought about Karen in Tacoma and whether she had made the right call. I thought about what she used to say in the 3rd year, when the silence had become the oppressive kind, that there's a difference between being alone and being isolated, and that difference is whether the world can reach you. In Tacoma she could feel the world. She could walk to a coffee shop and sit in the presence of strangers and absorb the low-grade proof of other people's existence and feel, in whatever primitive part of the brain handles that accounting, that she was included in the count. Here there was no count. Here you existed on your own authority, without corroboration, and some nights that felt like freedom and some nights it felt like something much closer to what the word forgotten actually means. I slept badly. I lay in the dark and I listened to the forest and I thought about the shoe. A size 4. Red with a white sole. A child who pronated outward and had worn that shoe long enough to compress the tread asymmetrically. I thought about the fire and how warm the ash had been, and I thought about the fact that whatever had been in that clearing had not left a trail I could follow, which meant either that they had left before the snow or that they had left in a way that didn't produce the kind of evidence snow is designed to record, which is a sentence I turned over in my mind for a long time in the dark. At 2 in the morning I heard something in the tree line behind the house. Not a sound that alarmed me, initially. A branch moving, a shift of weight in the spruce, the kind of noise that a moose or a bear makes when it moves through dense conifer, not stealthy, not deliberate, just large and indifferent to the noise it generates. I lay still and listened, and it moved east along the tree line, which was normal, which was the movement pattern of large game on a corridor parallel to the open ground. Normal. Fine. Then it stopped. The silence that followed had the specific texture of something that has become aware of being listened to. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of held breath, of a decision being made on the other side of a partition. I lay in the dark and I did not move, and the wood stove ticked as the fire settled, and outside nothing moved for 11 minutes, which I know because I was watching my phone clock with the specific, degrading attention of someone who has decided that counting is a form of control. At 11 minutes, something knocked on the back door. Not scratched. Not bumped. Knocked. 3 times, evenly spaced, with the tempo of someone who has knocked on doors before, who understands the social contract of the gesture, who knows what it means and is deploying it deliberately. I got up. I want to be clear that I understand this was not the correct choice, and that every horror movie ever made has dramatized precisely this choice and its consequences, but I want you to understand what it is like to be alone in a house in the Alaskan wilderness at 2 in the morning when something with that kind of intentionality announces itself at your back door. The alternative, the lying still in the dark alternative, felt indistinguishable from surrender. I got up and I took my rifle from beside the bed and I walked to the kitchen and I stood in front of the back door for a moment. Then I turned on the exterior light and looked through the window in the door. The back porch was empty. Undisturbed. The snow beyond the porch stretched to the tree line in an unbroken white surface, and in that surface, leading from the trees to the porch steps and up to the door and no further, as if whatever made them had stepped to the door and then simply stopped existing, were footprints. Bare feet. Adult-sized, I thought, though the edges were slightly blurred by a thin surface deposit of wind-moved snow. Human in their architecture, heel, arch, the 5 distinct impressions of toes. Coming from the trees. Reaching the door. Ending. No return tracks. No prints leading away. I stood at the door for a long time looking at them. The exterior light was on. The forest was dark beyond its reach. The temperature outside was 18 degrees and the footprints in the snow had been made by bare human feet, and whatever made them had come to my door and knocked and then was not on my porch and had not walked away. I called Bill Okafor at 2:17 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which told me either that he'd been awake or that he is the kind of person who answers at 2 in the morning without requiring it to have been a reasonable hour. I told him about the knock and the prints. I described them. He was quiet. Then he said, "Don't open the door." "I didn't open the door," I said. "Bill, what is this? What do you know about this?" He was quiet for another moment. "There are things that happen up here," he said slowly, choosing the words the way you choose steps on uncertain ice, "that I have lived next to for 40 years and that I do not understand and that I have made a decision not to understand. You came from somewhere else. You came here and you built a life here, and I respect that." He paused. "But Owen, some of what lives in these woods has been here longer than we have. And some of it is curious. And the best thing you can do when it comes to your door is not answer it." "The shoe, Bill," I said. "The child's shoe in the clearing." "I know," he said. "Have there been children?" "I know about the shoe," he said, and his voice had changed in a way I couldn't fully interpret, not harder but more closed, like a door not quite shut but no longer inviting passage. "Owen, are all your doors locked?" I checked. They were. "Go to sleep," he said. "In the morning it'll be gone." He was right. In the morning the porch was empty and the prints in the snow were still there and nothing had been disturbed, and the forest looked exactly the way it always looked, beautiful and vast and entirely unconcerned with my well-being. I put the property on the market that week. The listing agent, a woman out of Wasilla named Deanna, told me the market was soft and to expect a long sale timeline, and that the remoteness of the location would limit the buyer pool, and that I should think carefully about the price. I told her to list it at whatever moved it fastest. She looked at me the way people look at sellers who have made a decision that is not financially optimal and has something behind it they've chosen not to share. I am renting a 1-bedroom apartment in Anchorage while the sale processes. It's loud. The family above me has 2 kids who run at hours that suggest no adult supervision, and the couple next door argues about money with the volume and commitment of people who have not yet learned that apartment walls are acoustically transparent. The parking lot light comes through my bedroom window all night and makes it impossible to get fully dark. I sleep better than I have in 3 years. Last week a family put in an offer on the property. Couple in their mid-30s, relocating from Denver, 2 kids. The offer was below asking but reasonable, and my agent recommended I accept. I countered. They accepted the counter. Closing is in 6 weeks. I have not called them. I have not told them about the elk or the line or the clearing or the shoe, which Trooper Hendricks told me a follow-up call had been collected as evidence, but that the inquiry was ongoing and he could not share details. I have not told them about the knock at 2 in the morning or the prints in the snow or what Bill Okafor said about things that are curious. I have thought about calling them every day for 3 weeks. I have opened my contacts and found the number their agent gave us, and I have looked at it for long periods of time. I tell myself they'll be fine. I tell myself the property is beautiful and the land is real, and 12 acres near Talkeetna with a view of Denali on clear days is exactly what someone looking for that life needs, and that what happened to me was anomalous, was unexplainable, was a set of circumstances unlikely to recur. I tell myself they don't have children the right age. Then I remember the shoe. Red, white sole, size 4. The worn tread. The child who pronated outward. And I think about their kids in Denver, packing up their rooms, putting their shoes in boxes, excited about the adventure. And I close my contacts and put my phone face down on the table and sit in my loud, lit, imperfect apartment with the family running overhead and the couple arguing next door, and I am so grateful for every single sound that I could weep. I don't call them. I know that makes me a coward. I'm making my peace with that. I've been driving the same 312 miles of frozen hell every Tuesday and Thursday for going on 2 years now, and I still haven't figured out if that makes me brave or just too broke to quit. The route starts in Anchorage, real Anchorage, the one with the Walmart and the Applebee's and the kind of traffic that makes you feel like you're still connected to something resembling civilization, and it ends somewhere outside of McGrath, a town so small and so far from everything that most people in the lower 48 don't just not know where it is, they don't know it exists at all. In between those 2 points there is nothing. I don't mean nothing in the way people from Ohio say nothing when they mean there's no Starbucks for 20 minutes. I mean nothing the way God means nothing. Absolute, geological, indifferent nothing. Spruce trees so dense and dark they look like walls. Ice that doesn't melt in April. A sky that in winter goes from black to gray and back to black without ever really becoming day. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like an absence of sound so much as a presence of something else entirely. I took the job because I owed $47,000 in medical debt from my ex-wife's surgery, which she had while we were still married, which meant the bills came to me after she left. That's the kind of math that makes a man sign contracts without reading them carefully. The pay was good, really good, good enough that the number on the offer letter made my hands shake a little, and the company covered housing, which in my case meant a studio apartment in Anchorage that smelled like someone else's cigarettes and looked out onto a parking lot full of trucks that never seemed to move. I told my mother I was doing fine. I told my brother the scenery was incredible. I told myself that 2 years wasn't a long time, that I'd pay off the debt, go back to Portland, start over somewhere familiar. Somewhere where the dark didn't feel like it had weight. The truck itself was a 2019 Kenworth T680, company-owned, smelling of pine air freshener and old coffee and the particular staleness of a cab that's been lived in by a succession of men who were all, in some fundamental way, running from something. The radio setup was standard, AM/FM, a CB on channel 19, and the company's dispatch frequency locked to channel 9. There was also a secondary scanning unit mounted below the dash, an older model, the kind with a digital readout in green that I always thought looked vaguely like something from a horror movie prop department. The dispatcher, a man named Gerald who I'd spoken to maybe 40 times and never met in person, told me during orientation that the scanner was just for monitoring emergency frequencies. Forest Service, state troopers, fish and game. He said it in the way people say things they don't think matter. The first time I heard the frequency, I'd been on the road for about 6 hours and the temperature outside had dropped to -22. It was January. The moon was full and the snow reflected it in a way that should have been beautiful but instead just made everything look overexposed, like the world was a photograph taken wrong. I was somewhere between Talkeetna and the turnoff that takes you northwest toward the Susitna Valley, a stretch where the road narrows and the trees press in close on both sides and you can go 40 minutes without seeing another set of headlights. The scanner found it on its own. I didn't touch anything. 1 second there was static, and then there was a voice. A woman. Clear as a phone call. No static, no interference, just a clean, flat female voice reading numbers and coordinates with the steady cadence of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The coordinates meant nothing to me then. I didn't have them memorized the way I do now. I just heard a series of numbers repeated at what I'd later time as exactly 90-second intervals, and I remember thinking that it was some kind of automated beacon, a GPS marker, something routine. I almost changed the frequency. Almost. What stopped me was the quality of her voice. It wasn't robotic. It wasn't the clipped, affectless tone of a computer-generated reading. It had texture. Fatigue. The faint sound of someone breathing between sequences. It sounded like a woman sitting alone in a small room somewhere, reading numbers from a piece of paper in the middle of the night, with nowhere else to be. I listened to it for 2 hours straight. By the time I reached the McGrath delivery point and started unloading pallets of dry goods and medical supplies in the dark, I had the intervals memorized. 90 seconds. Every time. The kind of precision that doesn't come naturally to human beings but that also doesn't feel like a machine. I didn't think much about it on the drive back. I was tired. The roads had gotten icy around Nikolai and I had to drop my speed and concentrate. I ate a gas station sandwich somewhere near Talkeetna that tasted like it had been made during a previous decade. I called my mother from the Anchorage city limits and told her I was fine, the scenery was incredible, I'd call again Sunday. The second night the frequency was there again before I even looked for it. I reached down to turn on the scanner out of habit and it was already broadcasting, already mid-sequence, the same voice, the same intervals, the same coordinates. I pulled over on a dark section of road just north of Willow and entered the coordinates into my phone's map application. The pin dropped on a point about 2.5 miles east of where I was parked. I sat with that for a long moment. The heater was running. Outside, the temperature display on the dash read -18. The trees on either side of the road were absolutely still. No wind. No movement. The kind of quiet that makes your own breathing sound obscene. I told myself it was a logging operation. A survey marker. A hunting camp with its own beacon. Alaska is full of people who set up private communication systems because the state is enormous and the infrastructure is fragile and you learn fast that the government isn't going to save you if something goes wrong. I pulled back onto the road and kept driving and listened to the voice count out its coordinates for another hour and a half until I hit the stretch near Trapper Creek where the signal died. That was fine. That was explainable. Terrain interference. Everybody knows certain valleys kill radio signals. I turned on the FM and found a country station out of Wasilla playing something I didn't recognize and turned it up loud and didn't think about the coordinates again for the rest of the night. The third time, she said my name. I want to be precise about this because I've thought about it every day since and I need to be precise. She didn't break her pattern. She didn't pause. She didn't sound alarmed or human in any new way. She simply incorporated my name into the sequence the way you'd incorporate a new variable into a formula. The coordinates. A 90-second pause. Then, Daniel Marsh. Coordinates as follows. And then the numbers again. My full name. Daniel Marsh. Spoken in that flat, measured tone like it was just another piece of data. Like I was a location. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder so fast the back end fishtailed on the ice, and I sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel and my heart doing something it had never done before, something that felt less like beating and more like trying to escape. The heater was still running. The green digital readout on the scanner was still glowing. Outside, nothing moved in the dark between the trees. I grabbed the CB and raised Gerald on channel 9. Gerald, this is Daniel on the McGrath run. I need you to check something for me. His voice came back after a few seconds, calm and unhurried the way it always was, a man eating a sandwich at a console in some warm Anchorage office. He confirmed he was reading me. I told him about the scanner. I told him the frequency. I did not tell him my name yet because I hadn't decided what to do with that piece of information. There was a pause. Longer than I liked. That frequency is not in our emergency monitoring system, he said. That frequency isn't allocated to any active service in Alaska that I can see in our system. What do you mean not active? Another pause. I mean, I'm looking at the frequency registry, and that band was assigned to a search and rescue relay station that operated out of a point north of Talkeetna. It was decommissioned. When? Hold on. I could hear him typing. Keys clicking in the warm distant office while I sat on the side of a frozen highway in the dark with the voice of a woman reading my name every 90 seconds through a green-lit machine. 1987, he said. Station went dark in November of 1987. The operator, he stopped. The operator what, Gerald? The operator was listed as missing. She disappeared during a night shift in November. They found the station running, but she was gone. Search never recovered her. He paused again. Daniel, how are you receiving a signal from a decommissioned station? I didn't have an answer for that. I don't have one now. What I know is that I sat on that shoulder for 23 minutes, which I know because I kept checking the clock on my phone the way you do when you're trying to anchor yourself to something factual and measurable. The temperature outside was -24. The signal continued. My name, the coordinates, the 90-second intervals. At some point I realized the coordinates were no longer the same ones she'd been broadcasting. They'd changed. I entered them into my phone with fingers that were not entirely steady. The pin dropped on my exact location. Not nearby. Not approximate. The GPS precision of a smartphone placed the pin directly on top of the road I was parked on, in the spot I was sitting, within what the application estimated as a margin of error of about 3 meters. The scanner had somehow, from a decommissioned relay station broadcasting out of the wilderness north of Talkeetna in 1987, resolved my position to within 3 meters and was now broadcasting it in the voice of a woman who had vanished during a November night shift almost 4 decades before I was born. I turned the scanner off. I drove. I did not stop again until Anchorage. 3 hours and 11 minutes of driving with the FM radio at a volume that made my ears hurt and both hands on the wheel and my eyes moving between the road ahead and the scanner unit below the dash with its black screen and its dead green display and its absolute silence. I watched it the way you watch a dark corner of a room after you've convinced yourself there's nothing in it. With the knowledge that the watching itself is a kind of confession. In the parking lot of my apartment building, I sat in the truck for a long time before I went inside. The streetlights reflected off the ice in the lot. The other trucks sat motionless the way they always did. Inside my apartment there was a television and a microwave and a bed and a refrigerator containing things I bought at a Car's supermarket in a city where I had no friends, no family, no one who would notice within any reasonable time frame if I stopped coming home. That is not self-pity. That is arithmetic. The arithmetic of a man who moved to Alaska for money and ended up somewhere that is not quite a life. I thought about the woman. The operator. I didn't know her name. I looked it up later, and I'll get to that, but I thought about her that night in a way that felt uncomfortably personal, like thinking about someone you've never met but somehow recognize. She had worked alone, I imagined. Long shifts in a small station somewhere in the trees, reading coordinates into a microphone, monitoring emergency frequencies, being the human presence in the system for people who were lost in the wilderness, people who needed to be found. And then one night she wasn't there anymore. The station kept running. Whatever she'd been doing at the console continued by automation or by something else, continued for hours or days until someone came to check, and they found the equipment running in her absence and nothing to explain the gap between those two facts. I wondered if she'd been afraid. I wondered if she'd had time to be. The following Tuesday I drove the route again. I needed the money. That's the honest answer, and I'm not ashamed of it. I am a man who owes $47,000 in fear, real fear, the documented irrational kind that wakes you at 3 in the morning and makes you check door locks twice, is still cheaper than debt collection. I drove the route with the scanner switched off. I drove it in deliberate, focused silence, and I ate my gas station food, and I called Gerald on Channel 9 twice just to hear a human voice, and the drive was unremarkable, and I delivered the supplies, and I came back, and I told myself that was it. That was the whole story. A weird frequency, a coincidence, Gerald looking up old records late at night in a warm office. These things have explanations. This is America. Things have explanations. The scanner turned itself on outside of Willow. I watched it happen. I was not touching the unit. Both hands were on the wheel. The digital display went from black to green and the frequency resolved and the voice came through and she said my name first this time, before the coordinates, which was new. Daniel Marsh. Just that, with a pause after it that was longer than 90 seconds. Long enough that I thought, absurdly, hopefully, that it was over. That whatever this was had concluded itself. Then she said, turn around. Not coordinates. Not a sequence. 2 words in that flat, tired voice. Turn around. Spoken with the patience of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something simple. I did not turn around. I drove. I watched the scanner. The frequency died 20 minutes later when I entered the valley north of Trapper Creek, the same dead zone as always, and it didn't come back, and I made the delivery and came home and sat in my truck in the parking lot for 45 minutes and ate a cold breakfast sandwich and stared at the scanner and felt, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely, completely afraid in the way children are afraid, not of a specific thing but of the space where a specific thing might be. I found her name in a newspaper archive. Carol Ann Fuentes. 29 years old in November of 1987. From Kenai, originally. She worked the Talkeetna relay station for 14 months before she vanished. The article was brief, the kind of brief that tells you the newspaper didn't expect the story to develop. Search and rescue. I covered an 8-mile radius and found nothing. No blood. No sign of struggle. No footprints leading away from the station in the snow. The door had been found open. The equipment had been found running. And Carol Ann Fuentes had been found nowhere, had been found never, had been listed as a missing person and then, presumably, reclassified in some office somewhere as a probable death and filed away in the particular drawer where Alaska keeps its disappeared. I drove the route the following Thursday. I don't know why. I know I told myself, the debt, the money, the math, But the truth is something more disturbing than that, something I've only recently begun to admit. I wanted to hear her. I wanted the frequency. I had started to need it the way you need something that frightens you, the way a person will keep pressing on a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. There is a specific horror in realizing that the thing that terrifies you has also, somehow, become company. She was there before I cleared the Anchorage city limits. Clearer than she'd ever been. No static. No interference. Just Carol and Fuentes reading coordinates in a voice that had been missing since 1987, reading them on a frequency that hadn't transmitted in nearly 4 decades, reading them directly into the cab of my truck on a highway where the temperature was -27 and the only light was my headlights cutting into a darkness that had no bottom. The coordinates she was broadcasting were not mine this time. I entered them at a red light in Wasilla, fingers moving fast, not wanting to look at them too long before I knew where they were. The pin dropped on the relay station. The old Talkeetna station. The one that had been decommissioned in November of 1987. She repeated the coordinates 4 times. Then she said my name. Then she said, "I'm still here, Daniel. I've been waiting for someone who could hear me." Then she said, "Don't come. And here is the thing I need you to understand. Here is the part one have not told Gerald or my mother or my brother or anyone else, because I don't have language for what happened next that sounds like something a sane person would report." After she said "don't come," after that final transmission in that flat exhausted voice, the scanner went dead. The display went black. And in the silence that followed, in the -27 darkness on a highway between Wasilla and Willow with the trees pressing in on both sides, I realized that I had been receiving that frequency for 3 weeks, that Carol and Fuentes had been broadcasting my name and my coordinates and finally a warning, and I realized something else, something that arrived not as a thought but as a physical sensation, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. She had said "don't come." "No, I'm fine." Not "it's nothing." Not "you're imagining things." She had said "don't come," which means there is somewhere to come to. Which means whatever kept the equipment running after she disappeared, whatever has been maintaining that signal for 38 years on a decommissioned frequency, whatever has been learning the names of the drivers who passed through that corridor and tracking their positions with a precision number 1987 relay station should be capable of, it is still there. It is still operating. And now it knows mine. I submitted my resignation to the company the next morning. Gerald processed it without comment, which told me either he didn't remember our conversation about the frequency or he remembered it very well. I drove south to Anchorage to collect my things. I drove south past a point in the valley north of Willow where the signal always died, and then past Wasilla, and then into the city, and I packed my apartment in 4 hours, which wasn't hard because I'd never really unpacked. I thought about Carol and Fuentes from Kenai, 29 years old, sitting alone at a console in November in the dark, and I thought about whether she'd had time to understand what was happening to her, and I thought about the door found open and the equipment found running in the snow that held no footprints leading away. I was loading the last box into my car when my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. Alaska area code. I answered it without thinking, the way you do. Static. And then, beneath the static, faintly, the rhythm of a woman breathing. And then, in a voice I recognized because I'd been listening to it for 3 weeks, in the flat, patient tone of someone reading from a list, my new address in Portland. My mother's phone number. My brother's home address in Boise. All of it correct. All of it current. All of it spoken in the voice of a woman who has been missing since 1987 and who is, I now understand, not missing at all. She is still broadcasting. She is very good at finding people. And whatever taught her how to do it is still there, in a station somewhere in the trees north of Talkeetna, with the door open and the equipment running, patient the way only the wilderness knows how to be patient, waiting for the next driver who tunes to the wrong frequency and stays on it a little too long. I sleep with the lights on now. It doesn't help. I took the job because I needed to disappear for a while, which, looking back, is the most profoundly stupid reason a person can have for moving to the gates of the Arctic National Park. Not Anchorage. Not Fairbanks, which at least has a university and a Chili's and enough light pollution to remind you that humanity exists. I mean the park itself, 6.5 million acres of wilderness above the Arctic Circle, the least visited national park in the entire United States, a place so remote that there are no roads leading into it, no visitor centers, no marked trails, no infrastructure of any kind beyond a handful of ranger stations that feel less like buildings and more like apologies. The kind of place that doesn't appear on the mental map most Americans carry around of their own country. I had friends in Tampa who genuinely asked me if Alaska was near Canada. I told them it was near nothing. That was the most accurate thing I said in 2 years. My name is Owen Greer. I was 34 when I accepted the seasonal position, recently divorced, recently relocated from my apartment in Orlando to my mother's guest room in Kissimmee, recently arrived at the specific variety of desperation that makes a man scan federal job listings at 2 in the morning and apply for positions he has no business applying for. I had a biology degree I barely used, some hiking experience from weekends in the Ocala National Forest, and a need to be somewhere that wasn't anywhere I'd been before. The National Park Service sent me an offer letter. I accepted it before I finished reading it. The salary was not good. That's what nobody tells you about working for the federal government in wilderness preservation. The pay is structured in a way that communicates, clearly and without apology, that the agency does not expect you to have financial obligations. No dependents, no debt, no ambitions beyond the work itself. I had an ex-wife, a car payment, and $32,000 and a shared credit card balance that a judge had decided was my problem. I took the job anyway. I told myself the housing stipend would help. I told myself the experience would look good on future applications. I told myself a lot of things in that period that I no longer believe. The station I was assigned to was a day's bush plane flight from Bettles, which is itself a town of about 12 people accessible only by air or a road that becomes impassable for significant portions of the year. From Bettles you fly northwest over terrain that starts dramatic and gets more so until it stops making visual sense, until the scale of the mountains and the rivers and the unbroken spruce flats below you is so far outside anything your brain was designed to process that you stop trying to process it and just sit with it, hands in your lap, watching the world be vast and indifferent through a scratched plexiglass window. The station was a log and timber structure about the size of a one-car garage. It had a wood stove, a two-way radio, a cot, a shelf of field guides, and a window facing north that framed a view of a river valley so beautiful it made me feel, every single morning, like I was being mocked. There was no cell service. There was no internet. There was a satellite phone for emergencies that I was instructed to use with extreme conservatism because the agency was, the training coordinator told me with a straight face, managing costs. I was one of 3 rangers covering an area the size of Connecticut. Most days nobody came. Some weeks nobody came. I'd like to describe the loneliness accurately because I think it's important and because I don't think people from the lower 48, people with their notifications and their group chats and their knowledge that a Walgreens is never more than 8 minutes away, have a framework for what I mean when I use that word in that context. It isn't sadness, exactly. It's closer to erasure. You wake up and the wilderness is there and it doesn't know you exist and it doesn't care, and that's not a metaphor, that is the literal operational reality of your day. You make coffee and eat powdered eggs and the river outside moves the way it moved before there were people to watch it, and the mountains don't accommodate you, and the silence is not peaceful, it is geological, it is the sound of a world that preceded you and will outlast you by an amount of time too large to mean anything. After a few months of it you start to understand why isolation is considered a form of punishment. You start to miss things you never thought to value. Traffic noise. the smell of a restaurant, the specific sound of a television in another room, not even one you can hear clearly, just the presence of it, the proof that someone nearby is alive and consuming an ordinary. I thought about Florida constantly, not just as a place but as a sensation. The specific weight of humid August air. The way afternoon thunderstorms in Orlando build on the horizon for hours before they arrive, all that theater, all that warning. The flat greenness of it. The overwhelming, slightly oppressive aliveness of it. I had a photograph of Clearwater Beach taped to the wall above my cot, just something I pulled off the internet and printed in the Bell's post office before my last supply flight, and I looked at it every night before I slept and made myself promises about what I would do when my contract ended. 8 months. Just 8 months, and then I'd drive south until the temperature was reasonable and never, not once, apply for another position north of the 45th parallel. I was a month into my second summer season when the man came in with the map. It was mid-July, which in gates of the Arctic means perpetual daylight, that unsettling Arctic phenomenon where the sun just circles the sky without setting, where 2 in the morning looks identical to 2 in the afternoon, where your body slowly loses its confidence in time itself and you start sleeping in short, unconvinced intervals that never feel complete. The visitor arrived at the station on foot, which was unusual. Most backcountry travelers have either been dropped by bush plane or have registered an entry through Bettles or Coalfoot, the small community south of the park off the Delta Highway. He hadn't registered. He had no visible pack frame, just a small canvas bag worn across one shoulder, and he was dressed practically but not in the modern technical gear you see on serious backcountry hikers. Nothing wicked or overtly wrong about him. Medium height, late 40s maybe, weathered in the way people get when they spend real time outdoors, as opposed to the performed weathering of the REI crowd. He was calm. Polite. He smiled when I opened the door and said he hoped he wasn't interrupting. He said he was doing a solo traverse and would be back through in 3 days. He asked if I could hold something for him while he was out. The map was rolled inside a cardboard tube, the kind architects use. He handed it to me with both hands, which I thought was odd, the small, unconscious ceremony of the gesture, like he was transferring something that required care. He told me to keep it safe, that it had some personal significance, and that he'd collect it when he came back through. He gave me a name, Marcus Webb, which I wrote in the visitor log. He declined water and supplies, which hikers almost never decline. He walked back into the trees and I stood in the doorway watching him until the spruce swallowed him and the silence came back, and then I went inside and looked at the tube on my desk for about 20 minutes before I opened it. I'm not sure why I opened it. Professional curiosity, I told myself, which is what people tell themselves when they want to do something and need a reason that doesn't involve admitting they simply want to do it. It was a map of the park. That part was unremarkable. It was drawn by hand, which was more unusual, rendered in ink on what felt like drafting paper, and it was detailed in a way that suggested either professional cartographic training or an obsession that had produced equivalent results. Every topographic feature I could identify matched the official USGS maps I had on the station shelf. Ridgelines, drainages, elevation contours, the river valley outside my window rendered with a precision that was, honestly, impressive. The kind of map a person makes when they know a place intimately. But the circles were wrong. There were 9 of them, scattered across the map in what my brain kept trying to interpret as a pattern without quite resolving one. Hand-drawn, slightly irregular, filled with a lighter ink that gave them a translucent quality. No labels. No coordinates. Just circles, distributed across the wilderness in positions that seemed deliberate without being explicable. I studied them for a while, cross-referencing with the USGS map, trying to identify what features they might be marking. They didn't correspond to any campsite, water source, or landmark I could identify. They sat in the middle of nowhere, which in gates of the Arctic is saying something, because nowhere here is more nowhere than anywhere else. I rolled the map back up, put it in the tube, and set it on the shelf next to the field guides. That evening, which looked like afternoon, which looked like morning, which is the particular madness of Arctic summer, I was updating the visitor log and I noticed that one of the circles on the map, which I'd unrolled again because I couldn't stop thinking about it, appeared to have moved. I want to be a rational person. I want to be the kind of man who has an explanation for things, who applies Occam's razor and arrives at the least dramatic interpretation and moves on. I had been alone for 6 weeks at that point in the rotation. I was sleeping poorly. I had been staring at that map for hours, and my memory of exactly where each circle had been was not a surveyed measurement. These are all true things. I inventoried all of them, standing at my desk at what my clock said was 10:47 in the evening and what the light outside said was mid-afternoon, and I decided the circle had not moved and I was tired and I needed to sleep. I made a pencil mark around each circle. Small, precise, just outside the ink perimeter. Then I slept. In the morning, 3 of the pencil marks did not align with the circles. The circles were closer to the station. I radioed Gerald. There was no Gerald here. The contact was a duty officer named Patterson in the Fairbanks regional office, and I told him I had a visitor log entry for a Marcus Webb and could he run it. Patterson said he'd check. He called back 40 minutes later and said there was no Marcus Webb registered on any entry point for the current season. Not Bettles, not Coldfoot, not Anaktuvuk Pass, which is the only actual village inside the park boundaries, and a Nupiat community of about 100 people who have lived in that landscape for thousands of years and who, the few times I had contact with them, seemed to regard park rangers with a combination of amusement and the specific patience people develop around those who don't understand where they are. I unrolled the map again. 5 circles now registered outside my pencil marks. The ones that had moved were all on the same side, the northwest side, the side that faced into the deeper wilderness, away from the river and the approach route from Bettles. They were advancing in a loose formation that my brain, doing the thing brains do when they're frightened, kept trying not to recognize as deliberate. I told Patterson I had a potential lost or distressed hiker and gave him the description of Marcus Webb. Patterson said he'd flag it in contact search and rescue in Bettles, and that someone would likely fly out the next day to check on me, weather permitting. Weather permitting. That is Alaska's version of "we'll get to it." That is what the 49th state says when it means you are on your own tonight. I spent that night, that endless sunlit night, sitting on the cot with my back to the wall, the map on the desk in front of me, watching. I watched it the way you watch something you know is wrong but can't stop meaning to confirm. Every hour I got up and checked the circles against my pencil marks. The first 2 checks showed nothing. The third check, around what my clock said was 3 in the morning and what the light outside said was a perfectly pleasant Tuesday afternoon, showed 1 circle that had moved significantly. Not an inch. Not an ambiguous amount. It had migrated across the page in a displacement I measured with a ruler from the field kit, 4.5 centimeters, which at the map's scale corresponded to approximately 2 miles. 2 miles from the station. I picked the map up. I was going to fold it, put it back in the tube, walk it outside and put it under a rock somewhere away from the building. That was my plan. What I noticed, holding it up to the light, and the light here at 3 in the morning in July is genuine, actual, full daylight, which means I was not working in shadow or ambiguity. What I noticed was that the circles were not drawn on the surface of the map. They were visible through it. I turned the paper over. Nothing on the back. The circles had no physical application on either surface. They were present in the paper the way a watermark is present, embedded in the material itself, in the fibers, not drawn but somehow intrinsic. Which was impossible. Which was, by any reasonable material understanding of what paper is and how marks are made on it, not possible. I put it back on the desk and sat down and took a series of slow breaths the way my therapist in Orlando had taught me before the divorce when I was having panic attacks in the parking lots of grocery stores. And I want you to understand the specific cruelty of applying a coping mechanism designed for a Publix parking lot to a situation in which you are alone at a ranger station above the Arctic Circle watching marks move inside a piece of paper while a man who doesn't officially exist walks toward you through 6.5 million acres of wilderness that doesn't care if you live or die. I thought about Florida. I thought about it with a desperation that was almost physical, almost an actual ache, the way you think about water when you're truly thirsty. I thought about the weight of the air there, the noise of it, the absolute democracy of people living in close proximity and being annoyed by each other, and that mutual annoyance being, in aggregate, the sound of civilization. I thought about the photograph of Clearwater Beach above my cot, and I looked at it and I said, out loud, in the empty station, to no one, 8 months. You had 8 months and you couldn't do it. The search and rescue team came the following morning, 2 men in a Cessna 185 from Bells named Hank and a younger man whose name I didn't catch. They were professional and unhurried, and they accepted my account with the non-committal neutrality of people who have heard strange things from rangers who've been alone too long and have learned not to engage with the content. They found Marcus Webb 4 miles northwest of the station, standing in a clearing, in perfect health, apparently unmoved by their arrival. Hank radioed me while the other man stayed with Webb. Found your hiker, he said. He's fine. Says he was just doing a traverse. What's his condition? Good, I said. He's fine. He's just standing there. A pause. He wants to know if you still have his map. I looked at the tube on the shelf. Tell him yes. He says he'll come get it. He can't come get it, I said. I'll bring it out. Tell him to stay where he is. I flew out with Hank. The other man, I never got his name. I've tried to remember it and it's simply not there, a gap where a detail should be, had stayed with Webb in the clearing. When we landed in a flat section of tundra nearby and walked in, Webb was standing exactly where Hank had left him. The unnamed man was standing about 30 feet away, which struck me as more distance than professional protocol required. He was watching Webb the way you watch an animal you're not sure about. I handed Webb the tube. He took it with both hands, the same small ceremony as before. Did you look at it? He asked. His voice was pleasant. Conversational. Yes, I said, because lying seemed dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. He nodded. He opened the tube and unrolled the map and looked at it for a moment and then looked up at me with an expression I have spent 1.5 years trying to categorize. It was not menacing. It was something closer to clinical. The expression of someone assessing a result. They move for you, he said. The circles. Yes. Where are they? He rolled the map back up. He looked at the wilderness around us, at the river valley and the ridgeline and the sky that even now at 10 in the morning had the flat, overlit quality of a stage set. He seemed to be considering how much to tell me, not out of cruelty but out of some sense of appropriate dosage. The way a doctor decides how specific to be. Locations, he said finally. They show where things are. He paused. The ones that don't move, those are places. Fix things. He looked at me. The ones that move follow living things. Animals. People. They move toward the station, I said. Yes, he said, without any indication that this was remarkable. Why? He put the tube under his arm. He looked at me for a moment with that same assessing expression, and then he said, very calmly, because they were following me. He paused again. And you're one of the only people I've met who can see them move. That's not common. Another pause. That's actually never happened before. Hank flew us back to the station. Webb declined transport to Bettles and walked back into the trees, and I stood in the station doorway and watched him go, and the wilderness took him the same way it had the first time. Clean. Complete. No trace. I quit the following week. Patterson processed the resignation by radio, asked if I was sure, accepted my confirmation without argument. The bush plane came and took me to Bettles, and from Bettles I caught a commuter flight to Fairbanks, and from Fairbanks I took the first available flight to Seattle, and from Seattle I drove my car, which had been in a long-term lot in Anchorage, south through Oregon and California and Nevada, and kept going until the air got wet and warm and the palm trees started appearing with the casual frequency of things that belong somewhere. I live in St. Petersburg now, 4 blocks from the water. I can smell the Gulf of Mexico from my apartment, that dense salt weight that should feel oppressive and instead feels like evidence that the world is full and loud and indifferent in the right ways, the survivable ways. I sleep with the window open. I listen to traffic and bar noise and the occasional argument from the apartment across the parking lot. I have never felt safer in my life than I do surrounded by that noise, that human mess. But I bought a journal 2 weeks after I moved in, a large one with graph paper pages, and some nights I find myself sitting at the kitchen table drawing. Not intentionally. Not from any decision I'm aware of making. I put the pen down thinking I'm going to write something, and then time passes in a way that doesn't account for itself, and when I look down at the page I draw a map. Every time. Detailed, precise, topographically accurate in ways I shouldn't be capable of from memory, the river valleys and the ridgelines of a wilderness I've been trying to forget. And on each map, in positions that shift from drawing to drawing, that never repeat, that seem to respond to something I'm not consciously tracking, circles. Embedded in the lines. Moving, I think, between the times I look at them, though I've stopped making pencil marks to confirm. Last week one of them was close to the Florida coastline. Last night it was 4 blocks from my apartment. This morning I woke up and the journal was open on the table to a page I don't remember drawing, a map I don't recognize, detailed and meticulous and covered in circles, all of them converging on a single point. And I understood, finally, what Marcus Webb had been trying to tell me in that clearing while the man whose name I can't remember stood 30 feet away and watched him with the caution of someone who had already learned what I was only beginning to understand, that the map doesn't show you what is out there. It shows what is coming. It has always shown what is coming. And whatever was following him through the wilderness of gates of the Arctic, whatever pressed those circles through the paper like a watermark, like something intrinsic, like something that had always been there, it wasn't following Marcus Webb. It was following the map. And the map is in my kitchen. And every circle on it is here. I want to tell you about Dale before I tell you about what happened to Dale, because I think it matters that you understand he was not the kind of man things happened to. Dale Pruitt was 41 years old, originally from Billings, Montana, third-generation oil industry, the kind of man who had been on rigs since he was 19 and who wore that fact the way other men wore military service, quietly, without apology, as a credential that explained everything about him that needed explaining. He had hands like 2 catcher's mitts and a laugh that came from somewhere anatomically lower than most people's laughs, and he drank his coffee black at temperatures that should have constituted a medical concern, and he had a daughter in Missoula who he called every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock regardless of what time zone the rig had theoretically placed him in. He was, in the specific vocabulary of men who work in dangerous places far from home, solid. The word people use when they mean the opposite of someone who is going to fall apart. I tell you this because what happened to Dale was the kind of thing that happens to fragile people in horror stories, to people who were already compromised somehow, already a little gone at the edges. That's how those stories work. That's the grammar of them. And Dale didn't fit the grammar, which is part of why it took me so long to understand what I was seeing. My name is Marcus Hale, and I am 44 years old, and I spent 31 months on a directional drilling platform operated by a company I will not name, located on the north slope of Alaska approximately 200 miles north of Fairbanks and somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 miles from the coast of the Beaufort Sea. If you are trying to locate this on a mental map and finding that your mental map doesn't extend that far, that's correct. That's accurate. The mental map that most Americans carry of their own country, the one with the coasts and the major cities and the highways connecting them into a coherent idea of a place, does not include where I was. We were north of the Brooks Range, north of Coldfoot, north of Wiseman, north of every named community that appears on a standard atlas. We were in the specific, ungovernable north that Alaska keeps past the point where most people stop looking, in a flat, treeless expanse of permafrost and gravel and wind so constant that you stopped hearing it after the first week and started hearing it again after the third, louder than before, the way tinnitus returns. I took the job because I was $53,000 in debt and my brother-in-law Kevin had worked North Slope for 8 years and retired to a house in Santa Fe with a paid-off mortgage and a boat he kept in storage because he lived in New Mexico, but he always wanted a boat and now he could have one. That's the math that sends men to the North Slope. Not adventure. Not patriotism. Not the particular romantic mythology of frontier labor that gets written about in magazines by people who have never been anywhere near a frontier. Just the math. The number at the bottom of the contract versus the number on the credit card statement and the terrible, clarifying simplicity of one being larger than the other. The rotation was 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. On the weeks off I flew to Fairbanks, and from Fairbanks I drove to a furnished apartment I rented near the university, which had the particular anonymous quality of all furnished apartments, the furniture that belonged to no one's taste, the walls painted the specific beige that exists only in spaces where no one intends to stay. I watched television. I went to the Fred Meyer on Airport Way and bought food I didn't particularly want and cooked it in a kitchen I didn't particularly like. I called my mother in Albuquerque twice a week and told her I was fine, the money was good, I'd be home for Christmas. She asked every time when I was coming back. I gave her the same answer every time. After the debt was gone. After I had the number Kevin had. The rig itself was, in the cold mechanical sense, an impressive piece of infrastructure. 11 stories of steel and pipe and hydraulics sitting on a gravel pad in the middle of a landscape so flat and open that on clear days the horizon was a perfect unbroken line in every direction, like someone had drawn it with a ruler. There were 32 men on the platform at any given time. We ate in a cafeteria that served real food, better food than most restaurants I'd been to, because the company understood that quality of food was a retention tool and retention on the North Slope was a perpetual operational concern. We slept in private rooms no bigger than a ship's cabin, and we worked 12-hour shifts, and in the 4 hours between end of shift and sleep there was a common room with satellite television and a weight room and a library of paperback novels that had been read and left by an accumulating succession of men over what I estimated to be at least 20 years, based on the copyright dates on the oldest ones. The polar night started in late November. I want to be specific about this because I think people who haven't experienced it, really experienced it as a sustained condition rather than a curiosity, underestimate what it does. The sun simply stops coming up. Not partially, not weekly, it stops. You go on shift in the dark, you come off shift in the dark, you eat and sleep and work through an unbroken blackness that the platform's exterior lighting holds back in a rough perimeter beyond which the darkness is total in a way that has physical weight. The stars were extraordinary, I'll give it that. On clear nights the Milky Way was a structural element of the sky, something solid-looking, and the aurora came through in colors that shouldn't have existed at that latitude and that atmospheric pressure, and I stood outside in -30 watching it move and felt, for minutes at a time, that this was worth something beyond the paycheck. Then I went back inside and the feeling evaporated in the fluorescent light of the cafeteria and I ate powdered eggs and thought about Albuquerque. Dale and I were assigned to the same drilling crew in my 7th month. We weren't friends immediately. Men in those environments don't make friends immediately. There's a calibration period where you observe each other's competence and reliability and gradually extend trust in proportion to what the observation confirms. But we became, within a few weeks, the particular kind of friends that dangerous work creates. The kind built on the knowledge that the other person's attention to detail is materially connected to your physical survival. He showed me a photograph of his daughter on his 2nd day. Her name was Lily and she was 8 years old and had Dale's exact nose, which seemed like a lot of nose for an 8-year-old, and he told me that without any awkwardness because he was a man entirely at peace with loving his daughter. I told him about New Mexico. He said he'd never been. I said it was hot and flat and full of sky, and he said that didn't sound so different from here, and I said it was different in every way that mattered. The first time Dale paused was in January. We were tightening the drill string, standard work, the kind of task that requires attention but not conversation, and Dale was on the coupling 2 feet to my left, and he just stopped. Not moved away from the task, stopped. Not got distracted, stopped. Stopped the way a machine stops when the power cuts, completely, all at once, in the middle of a motion. His hands were on the wrench, his body was in the posture of working, and nothing was happening. His eyes were open. His mouth was open approximately a centimeter, the way it had been while he was about to exhale before the pause began. I said his name. I said it twice. After about 35 seconds, I counted, because counting was the only response I had. He resumed, tightened the coupling, moved to the next one without any indication that something had happened. I asked him at dinner if he was all right. He said yes, genuinely puzzled by the question. I described what I'd seen. He listened carefully and shook his head and said he didn't remember any pause, that the last thing he remembered was the coupling and the next thing was the next coupling, and that was it. He said it evenly, without distress, the way he'd have described any other mechanical sequence. I reported it to the tool pusher, a man named Garrett who had run North Slope operations for 22 years and who responded to most information with the same measure of reserve that long experience in dangerous environments produces. He said he'd keep an eye on it. He said if it happened again we'd put Dale on light duties and get the company medic to evaluate him. He said these things in the tone of a man managing an equipment maintenance issue, because that was, in the operational grammar of a drilling platform, what it was. It happened again 4 days later. Then twice in 1 week. Then, in February, with an escalating frequency that I started recording in a notebook I kept in my bunk, dates, times, duration, circumstances. The medic saw Dale twice and found nothing. Blood pressure normal, reflexes normal, no neurological indicators, no history of seizure disorder. He recommended Dale see a specialist when he rotated off. Dale agreed and called his daughter on Sunday and sounded exactly like himself, and the following Tuesday he paused for 4 minutes and 17 seconds in the equipment bay while holding a pipe wrench, standing in the exact center of the room, while 3 of us stood at different points around the perimeter watching him and saying nothing because there was nothing to say. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I had my phone in my hand and I timed it. 4 minutes of Dale standing in the fluorescent light of the equipment bay with his mouth open 1 centimeter and his eyes open and completely empty, not blank. I want to make this distinction because it matters. Blank is an absence of expression. What Dale's eyes were in those moments was not absence but something that felt more like occupation, like the eyes were still functioning but what was behind them doing the looking was not Dale, and the 3 of us not speaking in the platform. Running around us with its constant industrial sound and the darkness outside the small high windows absolute and complete and the temperature outside -38. Then he finished the exhale and turned to the wall where the wrenches were hung and put the one he was holding back on its hook, which was not what he'd been about to do when he paused, and walked past us and out of the bay without a word. The conversations I had with myself in the weeks that followed were the conversations a rational person has when the evidence is outpacing the available explanations. Neurological event. Undiscovered seizure variant. Psychological dissociation. Stress response. Sleep deprivation compounded by polar night, by the calendar anomaly of a world without sunrise, by the specific cognitive erosion of living in a windowless rhythm of work and sleep severed from the cues the brain evolved to use for temporal orientation. I cataloged these explanations and I believed some of them on some days and fewer of them on other days, and by March, when Dale had paused 41 times by my count, I believed almost none of them. because of what he said to me in February. The pause ended the way they always ended, the small muscular shift, the resumption of breath, the return of whatever had been absent in his eyes. And then Dale looked at me, and I mean he looked at me specifically, not at the room, not at the general space ahead of him, but at me with the kind of directed focus that requires intent, and he said, in a voice that was his voice and its acoustic properties and not his voice in any other way, "You shouldn't have come in today." Then he blinked. Then he said he was hungry and wanted to know if dinner was still running. I wrote it in the notebook. The date, the time, the duration, and the sentence. 7 words. I turned them over in my mind for 2 weeks, trying to hear them as the output of a brain misfiring, as the random verbal production of a neurological glitch, as anything that was not what they sounded like, which was a message. Specifically a message directed at me. Specifically a message from something that was using Dale's vocal apparatus the way you use a phone, as a transmission mechanism, not as a thing with its own intentions. At the end of February I stopped sleeping in the way that actually restores you. I slept in the technical sense. I was horizontal and unconscious for the required hours, but I woke depleted every time, with the particular heaviness of someone whose brain has been working through the night on a problem it cannot solve. I lost weight. Garrett asked me twice if I was feeling well. I said yes. I ate more to support the answer. The morning of March 7th, Dale did not come to breakfast. This was unusual enough that I noticed it immediately, because Dale was constitutionally committed to breakfast, a man who treated the first meal of the day with a seriousness that bordered on devotional. I went to his room. The door was unlocked. He wasn't there. We found him 40 minutes later. Outside. He was seated on the gravel pad on the north side of the platform, the side that faced into the deepest darkness, the side that faced away from everything, away from the Dalton Highway to the south, away from Fairbanks, away from any evidence that the human world extended in that direction. He was in his work clothes. No coat. No gloves. Minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. He was seated cross-legged and upright with his hands on his knees and his face turned north and his eyes open, and when Garrett reached him first and grabbed his arm, Dale stood up with a fluid ease that should not have been possible on a body that had been stationary at minus 38 for an unknown period of time, and he walked back inside with Garrett's hand on his arm, and he did not appear to be in distress, and he did not appear to have frostbite, which the medic confirmed after a 90-minute examination with an expression I can only describe as professionally unsettled. Dale said he didn't remember going outside. He said the last thing he remembered was finishing his shift and going to his room. He said this with the complete, undefended honesty of someone reporting a factual gap rather than concealing a behavior, and I believed him, and that belief was the most frightening thing I encountered in 31 months on the North Slope. He was medically evacuated to Fairbanks the next morning. I called him 2 weeks later. He was in Missoula, in his apartment, 3 miles from his daughter. He sounded like Dale entirely. He said the specialist had found nothing. He said he felt completely normal. He said he had no intention of going back to the slope and that the company could take the remaining weeks of his contract and do whatever they wanted with them. He laughed when he said it, that low anatomical laugh, and I laughed too, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential, and at the end he said he missed the work, not the place, just the work, and I said I understood. He didn't ask me to tell him what I'd seen. I think he decided not to know. I stayed 4 more months. I want to explain this and I can't do it entirely satisfactorily. The money was still real, and the debt was still real, and the explanations I'd constructed around Dale's behavior, while structurally inadequate, were functional enough to stand on if I didn't press them too hard. I worked. I ate. I called my mother. I kept the notebook. But here's what I did not put in the notebook, because writing it would have made it more real than I was willing to make it. In those 4 months, I paused twice. The first time I was in the cafeteria, and the next thing I knew I was standing at the window on the north side of the common room with my hand on the glass and the darkness outside absolute and close, and I don't know how long I'd been there, but my coffee on the cafeteria table had gone cold. 30 yards I don't remember crossing. The second time I was on shift, and Carver, the roughneck who'd replaced Dale on our crew, said my name 3 times before I heard him, and when I turned to look at him, his expression was the expression I recognized from the outside, because I had been the one making it when it was directed at Dale, the careful, alarmed stillness of a man watching something he cannot explain and choosing not to name it because naming it would require doing something about it. I put in my notice the following week. I flew to Fairbanks and drove to the apartment near the university for the last time and packed the things I'd accumulated in 31 months of off-rotation living into the back of my truck, which didn't take long because I'd never really accumulated much, and I drove south on the Parks Highway toward Anchorage in a September that was already showing its winter intentions, the trees at their peak color, the light, that beautiful low slant of Alaskan fall that makes everything look like the last good day of something, and I thought about the notebook, which was in my bag, and I thought about whether I was going to take it with me or leave it in the apartment dumpster. I took it. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the only honest record of those 31 months. Maybe because destroying it felt like the kind of gesture that only matters if the thing you're destroying matters, and I wasn't ready to decide that. I drove through Wasilla and through Anchorage and caught a flight to Seattle, and from Seattle I flew to Albuquerque, where my mother picked me up at the airport and said I looked thin, and I said I was fine, and she made green chili stew, and I ate 2 bowls and fell asleep on her couch at 7:30 and slept for 11 hours, the first time I'd done that since before the North Slope. I live in Albuquerque now. A small house near the Sandia Mountains, the kind of house that costs what a used car costs in cities where people want to live, with a backyard that gets afternoon sun and a view of the mountains going pink at dusk. Kevin comes over sometimes with his wife and talks about the boat and storage with the particular fondness of a man who doesn't regret his choices, and I drink beer and listen, and I don't tell him about Dale, and I don't tell him about the pauses, and I don't tell him that some mornings I wake up at 3 in the morning and for a moment I don't know where I am, and in that moment I am afraid in a way that has no object, no specific thing to point at, just the fear itself, clean and enormous and directionless. I never should have left New Mexico. That's the conclusion I've arrived at after considerable time with the evidence. Not because Alaska was bad in the ways people mean when they say a place is bad. It was beautiful, and the work was real, and the money was exactly what it promised to be. But because there are places on this earth that are simply too far outside the perimeter of human density to be safe, not from weather or wildlife or the mechanical hazards of industrial work, but from whatever pays attention to isolation. Whatever notices when a man is unreachable. Whatever finds, in the specific vulnerability of a person who is 200 miles from the nearest city and surrounded by darkness for months at a time, an opportunity that it doesn't find in crowded, lit, noisy places where people are connected by 1,000 overlapping threads to the evidence of each other's existence. I think it was already in Dale when we met. I think it had been in him for a while, building towards something, using his pauses to practice whatever it was practicing. And I think when he left, when the medic and Garrett and the machinery of the company intervened and removed him from the platform and from the darkness and from whatever in that darkness had been working on him, I think it needed somewhere else to go. I think about this when I wake at 3 in the morning in Albuquerque, in the small house near the Sandia Mountains, with the city's glow coming through the curtains and the sound of traffic on Lomas Boulevard audible in the distance. I think about it and I wait. I count my breaths the way you count seconds when you're timing something. I feel my own hands. I check that I am continuous, that there is no gap between the moment I am in and the last moment I remember, that nothing has been inserted in the space between 1 second and the next. Most mornings the count is clean. Last Thursday morning I woke up in the kitchen. I was standing at the window, facing north, my hand on the glass. The backyard dark and quiet, and the Sandias invisible in the pre-dawn dark but present, out there, the way large things are present even when you can't see them. My coffee on the counter had gone cold, and the clock on the microwave said 4:47, and I had no memory of getting up, and the house around me was silent in a way that was not the silence of an empty house but the silence of a held breath, of something waiting to see what I would do. I stood there for a long time before I turned the kitchen light on. I stood there counting,